Um, well, so the first thing just to say is I'm only one of the editors of Red Pepper, and I don't want to speak on behalf of all the rest of the editors. Particularly because Red Pepper is very concerned to be a space where issues can be debated and where people from different perspectives on the left can feel at home. But I guess what I wanted to do was to address the question of what kind of political organisation, radical political organisation we need, or maybe what kinds, because I think it's important that we don't imagine that there's one. If we can just pin down one type of organisation, one particular way of going about things, we'll have it solved. But I'll come back to that. What I wanted to do mainly was to talk about an example that's particularly inspiring to me, and that's the example of the landless rural workers movement in Brazil. This is possibly one of the biggest, possibly the biggest kind of sustained social movement in the world. It's basically an organisation and a movement that grew up and became gradually more formalised in its structures during the 1980s. At a time initially when Brazil was under a military dictatorship, particularly to deal with the problems of landlessness and therefore rural poverty across Brazil. And the strategy that began to become the hallmark of what became the MST was basically to organise people to occupy unused land. Latin America has these vast latifundias, which are estates owned. One of the most unequal distributions of land in the world. Lots of it is completely unused, and in fact, there was from a previous era. And remains a law on the Brazilian statutes which allows the government to expropriate land which isn't being used productively and give it to landless people. But because the interests of the large landowners predominated in the political structures, it was necessary to find a way to force the government to do that. And the strategy that the MST came up with was this is the MSTs, the initials in Portuguese, was to organise people to occupy the land and demand that the government expropriate it and gives it to them. This strategy has actually been extraordinarily successful. The figures that I've seen put the number of put in terms of families, but something like 300,000 families settled on land, able to grow crops and make some kind of living for themselves as a result of the MST's activism and organising. Often, depending on where they're organising, MST militantes will sometimes go and try and recruit people from the slums of big cities. Often people who've migrated there from the countryside originally, or are perhaps one generation away from doing so. And there's a whole process of political kind of training and understanding what's necessary to do what is a very dangerous thing, actually, because the police don't take kindly to this kind of thing, and in fact the landowners generally mobilise kind of hired thugs and in order to try and get them off their land, which and there's been various deaths of MST militants and so on. But what they've done in the course of the decades that they've been doing this now is build a big movement, a movement that's developed its political ideas, that now has all sorts of infrastructure like a radio station, like a school for agroecology, and various other things, very kind of agricultural cooperatives to do sort of basic processing of various things, so that they're able to then, you know, keep some of the value of, you know, of what they produce in the communities. But it's done. I mean, I guess what you might ask at this stage is, how is this relevant to the UK and the problems that we face? And I mean, you know, we're looking at Brazil is a very different situation from the one we're facing. You know, a vast country, lots and lots of land, completely different types of poverty, all sorts of issues. So, for me, I guess there's a whole series of things that we can sort of principles that we can perhaps draw out of the MST experience that I think are relevant for what we ought to be doing in radical organisations. The first is that the MST organises ordinary people who are affected by poverty and landlessness to go and do something about it. It doesn't kind of stand and propagandise about the nature of the system, although it does do political education in the course of what it's doing, but it's basically around organising people and not and going and convincing people to take action to better their own situation. At the same time, like I said, it does political education, and it operates as an openly kind of socialist organisation. You know, not in the sense perhaps that, you know, we have our small revolutionary parties here, but it's that kind of discourse which animates the MST's understanding of the world. It operates democratically. You know, there's various. The movement is run through a kind of system of delegates to a conference and so on, but also its practice at a local level is is thoroughly democratic as well. And part of that is also taking, as previously been mentioned, the issue of women's liberation seriously. And there's various formal mechanisms through which, you know, for instance, delegates are there's often a system of one man and one woman being elected as delegates at various conferences and what have you, in order to try and embed that in the practice of the movement. It also isn't dogmatic. I mean, I'm sure there has been. You know, this is not a perfect movement. I'm sure, you know, this is, you know, the balance between holding on to ideas and being dogmatic in the face of new ideas is one that's, you know, I think it's probably often difficult to get right. But for instance, when the MST first started to organise, it imagined that it might be able to somehow compete with capitalist agriculture in some way on a sort of almost kind of Soviet model. And when it realised that that wasn't working, there was, over a period of time, a switch to a very different way of doing things. The idea of agroecology, which I don't have time to go into now, but has in turn fed into a global movement of peasants and food producers and what have you, who were taking that idea seriously. I mean, there are a few others, but one that I'll just, because I've got to wrap up, just finish on perhaps, is that it very much sees itself as part of a wider movement, and I think this is important. You know, it sees itself as part of a wider movement in Brazil. It sees itself as part of a wider movement globally, not just formally through the kind of affiliation to La Via Campesina, the global kind of peasant movement, but also as the movement in a more general and kind of less defined sense. And I think those are some of the things that it might be useful to kind of discuss as principles going forward. So anyway, I'll leave it there, and anything else I had to say, I'll maybe come back to you.